Here's my muffin. I made this muffin today, chat. I made these muffins today. Look at that blueberry goo. Just has some shit to say. I did the transform for the settlements data. Check the Discord and Tableau data. Damn, thanks. I did not stream the baking. It tastes very hot.
And School of Liberation. To summarize, the point of organizations and their purpose is twofold. Firstly, to directly aid our communities, and in doing so broadcast the failures of the capitalist system. And secondly, to build a preliminary form of dual power and equip the people with the necessary tools so that, in that crucial moment, we can properly take advantage and win our liberation. 4. Education and its importance. Now, what of education? This doesn't mean only reading theory, although that is of paramount importance too. It also means organic education through organizing, be it understandings of legal frameworks, public relations, basic medical knowledge, and computer know-how. The reason theory is important is because it is a guide to action. It is what allows us to properly understand the world around us and how to go about critiquing and, more importantly, changing it. If you're a new Marxist and want some advice on what you should be doing education-wise, take a look at this video here. If you'd like to get a basic reading list on socialism, take a look at this video here. The point of educating yourself in the theory is to be able to develop your criticisms of capitalism and to confidently and accurately share your understanding with your community and those around you. This, combined with direct action, is what builds class consciousness, the very first block towards abolishing capitalism. With that said, what about the other sort of education? Theory can be done on your own, or in groups, which is highly recommended, but interpersonal communication skills, how to handle conflict, basic cooperative and democratic participation, accurately finding a solution to a problem found through said cooperative effort, all this is something that can only really be done in groups. Finally, professional organizations tend to grow the, let's say, more boring but still very necessary stuff as well, from administrative skills and technical organization of transport groups, etc., to things like video editing and Photoshop skills or creative writing in the forms of pamphlets or seminars and more. 5. Mutual aid and basic organizing. With all the introductory stuff out of the way, let's get more concrete. Firstly, what is mutual aid? Mutual aid is collective coordination to meet each other's needs. We fundamentally understand that the systems we have in place are not going to meet those needs, and the aim of mutual aid projects is to develop this point. It's to set up alternative sources of that which your community is in need of, be it medical attention or housing or whatever else, accompanied by constant education, explaining why is it that their needs aren't being met in the first place. The best example that comes to mind, at least for the United States and other Western countries, is that of the Black Panthers. A dedicated Marxist group, they saw the direct injustices being dealt to their own African American communities, educated themselves with the relevant theory, and got to work developing a free children's breakfast program, community protection, free medical clinics and ambulance rides, aid to the elderly and infirm when they run errands, educational initiatives, and much more. Notice, they not only provided what their communities needed and weren't being provided in the first place, but also were delivering a clear and scathing criticism of the capitalist system and systemic racism in the US. To use an old Sufi adage, they not only fed the stomach, but the mind too. This process of educating those who benefited from the mutual aid projects of the Black Panthers instilled in those communities a drive for change, which is what made the Black Panthers so successful in the eyes of the working class, and so dangerous in the eyes of the ruling class. On a side note, the police, being the radiantly positive organization that it is, broke into the church storing the food for the Black Panther free breakfast program and destroyed it, mostly by urinating and stepping on it, just in case you ever doubted whose side they're on.
Fucking Yakubian devil shit. I swear to God. I read in the history books, right? It was taught in school that Malcolm X was, a heathen, a degenerate. The enemy of the people. The dangerous kind of nonconformity. I don't remember reading about, cops taking a piss on the food in a church that was delivered to schools for low-income children. They conveniently leave this out of the history books. I wonder why.
Something abundantly clear. Mutual aid is not charity. In times of crisis, the ruling class pushes very safe, sanitized, and fairly ineffective organizations revolving around charity, in which the decisions on what is needed, how much, where, and to whom are completely disconnected from the people who are most affected by them. These institutions aren't intended to get at the root cause of whatever the issue is, be it poverty or homelessness or drug abuse or whatever else. Instead, it's designed as a pretty PR game for the rich and influential to beautify themselves and their ever so generous philanthropy, without ever even attempting to correct the issue at hand. It's symptomatic.
My point is that in the history books, they allude to the fact that the Black Panther Party was somehow bad, that Malcolm X was bad. That's merely what I was stating. What? Yes, I remember specifically reading about how the Black Panther Party was an armed militia. The Black Panther Party was an armed militia group, a radicalized African-American militia group, and they were not perceived in a negative way at all. That's what the RATM song Take the Power Back was about, how schools teach a quite literally whitewashed view of history. Yeah, no, they do. I remember reading about how Black Panthers were not good. Yeah, because that is how they are perceived. That's how they are that's the reflection of the Black Panther Party in a lot of history books taught in you know, high school and middle school curriculum courses.
Treatment, not a cure, and it's intended to make humane a system that is inherently inhumane. Side note, the question of security is very important, but sadly can't be discussed at the present time. Some quick points are community defense, community patrolling, basic security knowledge, both armed and unarmed methods of self-defense, first aid, and legal knowledge. You should keep all this in mind, and the internet is your best friend. 6. The pitfalls of organizing. This topic deserves a video of its own, really, but there's no harm in briefly touching on it here. One of the main pitfalls is lifestyleism. Capitalism commodifies everything, and in today's world, even being woke, a performative demonstration of how in tune you are with an understanding of systemic bias against race, or sex, or class, or gender, exists as something right next to your favorite type of music. The liberation of us, the vast majority of humanity, isn't something to add onto a Twitter bio and that's that. The necessary serious follow-up on those convictions is required, otherwise it's a stale and impotent opinion that dies as soon as it's invoked. Another common pitfall is one of a lack of focus, rigid unquestionable hierarchies, and secrecy within the organization. In some cases, the material conditions of the moment demand secrecy. Important addresses or the starting point of some revolutionary action of some kind are relevant examples. In direct community organizing in a non-revolutionary moment, though, it's not only counterproductive but also harmful. Decision-making should be inclusive, clear, sympathetic, and open to suggestion or influence from the relevant community you're working in. There shouldn't be any central group or clique that's undemocratically chosen, which decides how everything works and will be organized. Not only does this set this one group out for burnout, but also directly harms our aims by dividing the organization into an us and them, tiering the core and essentially factionalizing or otherwise dissolving the organization in the process. A related point is
No, so right now right-wingers are trying to use woke as a pejorative or in a derogatory way, alluding to its performative elements, and that you are posturing yourself as being hyper aware of social conditions, the ramifications of our current structural violence that is upheld through policy, public policy in this country. You know, the whole white supremacist patriarchy and the hegemonic class kind of keeping this system intact. What's going on, Bert? So those who are, looking to talk about this are often criticized because online activism isn't necessarily the most productive and meaningful form of activism, although if it is your only way of doing activism, then by all means. I think that it's right now kind of a double-edged sword because it's the new anti-SJW rhetoric launched by right-wingers and shitheads on the internet. But there is this kind of we have a tacit understanding of how woke culture right now and woke scolding right now is replacing actual activism that could be done in real life. Yes, hacktivism. And the key word here is performative, right? If you are using it to just be a debate bro on the internet, then you're not necessarily using your voice or your platform to advocate for the things that matter to you in the most effective or meaningful way. Woke like how AOC votes presented on funding the police. Yes. Sure.
Paternalism, elitism, overpromise.
It would actually be you making that comment. Sorry, my notes are small. I would think that more so the woke criticism comes down to people like you saying exactly what you just said about AOC. This kind of concern trolling, even though it might be a real qualm that you have with AOC, that might be a very real criticism. But the counter to that, especially from the perspective of a leftist, if you feel as though we need to, and if you are a leftist, absolutely, abolishing the police is probably going to be one of your major agenda items that matters to you. What are you doing to help combat police brutality in your community would be the most commonly used counter argument to make to somebody who is using performative wokeness to try to criticize another leftist or another progressive, in this case AOC in Congress. Is it the most productive way to use your time? How will we combat crime?
And under-delivering. These organizations are educational institutions for those activists that take part, and the people are the professors. You're not graciously descending from the heavens to help them. You're building a mutually beneficial and cooperative movement aimed at growing the impetus for the abolishment of capitalism. The overpromising and under-delivering part is self-explanatory, and why proper accounting with checks and balances being in place are of paramount importance. Transparency with group finances, democratic participation, and how best these funds should be used, with clear communication along all lines can prevent potentially disastrous outcomes. Equally, the opposite is also an issue, being too tight-fisted.
My notes are small. Do you know how bills are typically packaged? Legislative bills? You have so many different bylines in a bill, so many different, you can think about it it's like an itemized list of programs and funding for programs that's kind of compounded into one legislative bill. So if you support one major program that's kind of bundled into this bigger list or this bigger package, congressional spending package, then this is where you're in a little bit of hot water. right? Because bills are not necessarily passed, and subsequent funding for bills are not necessarily passed individually in an itemized capacity. They're bundled, right? Compounded, aggregated. What would be the best word to put this? The best way to put this. Imagine thinking supporting a Stockton will solve all your problems. So yeah, whenever we're thinking about how a politician does not vote against a particular bill, you have to look into the details to see what other programs, whatever the congressional spending package entailed alongside funding for the police, right? AOC also supports or has voted in favor of the military budget. Why? I'll let you think on that for a second.
With funds or resources.
Do you think it's because she supports the military-industrial complex,
in
or
money
something
or
else?
time or labor or whatever else, can inhibit the positive influence of the organization, cultivating a cold and very pragmatic approach that distances us from the community that we're trying to reach in the first place. This is why I highlighted those more boring aspects earlier, such as legal knowledge and administrative practice. Many of these common issues can be corrected through solid accounting and transparency. This is only a small section, and there are many more we can talk about, but we can move on to the next point for now. 7. The co-option of progressive movements. The ruling class cares very little for the daily suffering of those underneath them, normally. I say normally because this balance is disrupted when a crisis occurs. Systems break down and are either out completely or in the process of being put back together. This exacerbates the daily inequalities and pulls the curtain back, so to speak. It is our job to expose these injustices and couple them with an appropriate analysis so that the temporary flare of people's anger and sense to contribute isn't lost after things calm down again. The ruling class hates crises not only because they expose setting inequalities, but also because they disrupt the status quo of surplus extraction and profit making, causing them to push the capitalist state to smooth all of this out as soon as possible so that normal can return. Most of all, it shows that the things you want and fight for, things like public transport, or healthcare, rent freezes or reductions, freezes on loan payments, with student loans being the most famous example that comes to mind, and much more are definitely possible. Before the crisis, they tell you they're not. During the crisis, all of a sudden the government rolls out temporary forms of the very things they told you were impossible. The current pandemic is an excellent example of this, with eviction moratoriums, increased unemployment benefits and income support, free public transit, suspensions of student loan payments, and more. This is in no way all-encompassing or even adequate, but it shows that it is possible given the right sort of impulse. Mutual aid, direct organizing, and a proper political program can build that impulse. Keep in mind though, successful growing movements face two responses from the powers that be. Either they are mercilessly harassed until they are crushed, like the Black Panthers were, or the government and corporations and the media catches on and tries to extend a friendly gesture, let's call it. They try to bring them into a sanitized fold, framing them as heroic volunteers helping impoverished communities, and slowly, bit by bit, making them part of the system, in tandem with charities and ineffective and defunded government programs and corporate initiatives. Eventually, these politicians and philanthropists begin associating and even attempting to direct such groups, with results that you may expect.
Philanthropists.
Remember, the reason these organizations exist is to show the failures of capitalism, to advocate for the abolishing of capitalism, and to build dual power in preparation of such an event. The aid that is extended in cooperation with various communities is to show that not only is a new world possible, but also why we want a new world, how we can achieve it, and how we can do it on our own terms as a class. We should never lose sight of our fundamental end goal. In times of crisis, we win concessions, but these are only as strong and lasting as the mobilizations that made them necessary. The only true change that can be maintained is by revolution. For a deeper dive into the pitfalls of solely reformism, check out this video I made here. 8. Concrete steps. What can we do immediately? This may sound a little silly, but talk. Talk to your family, your friends, your coworkers. Work within your community and bring together like-minded people. Join existing organizations if they're around, aid in currently existing mutual aid groups, and try to get involved in the organizing activity. Try to bring forth a simple to understand yet sharp criticism of capitalism. This is where the importance of educating yourself shines. You don't even need to mention socialism at first. It's enough to sow the seeds of doubt and to subsequently follow up when your community or those around you are more ready. Always relate your criticism of capitalism to people's direct issues. Lack of employment and healthcare, infrastructure, or even very specific material issues people face. Always properly analyze them and turn them into a quick, concise, and appreciated bit of knowledge to share about the failings of the current government and the capitalist system. The most fundamental point is to always be kind, patient, sympathetic, and non-combative. It doesn't matter how good your arguments sound or how much your organization has helped. If people feel you're arrogant, stubborn, inattentive, or just plain rude, a smile, a brisk, empathetic discussion, and an appreciation of others' perspectives, even if they're wrong, goes much farther than the debate bro facts and logic approach. Be kind, patient, and discuss with empathy. That's how we get people on our side.
Well, Chad, I feel like I'm, part of the problem. We're not always super duper nice to the right-wingers. But I understand what this person is saying. That if you're trying to form coalitions, especially in your community, and you're trying to reach across the aisle and talk to people to raise awareness or build capacity, literally trying to induce class consciousness into your neighbor, you're gonna have to be very, very careful. It's a very delicate discussion that you will have, right? And you have to be incredibly careful with how you approach these conversations. I'm going to need a year before I can be nice to right-wingers. Why a year? Like, what do you have to prepare for? Like, what all do you have to do to prepare for being nice to right-wingers in 1 year's time? Yes, we do have to meet people where they are, but we don't have to play nice with the fash. Absolutely. Absolutely, you are correct, Nico Mario. But I feel like the fash are so... The reason why I think it's really important to have these conversations too is because what do you think the fascists are doing right now? I mean, obviously, they are trying to do the exact same thing as leftists, but they're a little better at it. They are much better. They have a lot more political backing. There's a lot more money on the right side of politics, or, right-wing politics, where huge donors are funding think tanks and PACs and special interest groups. And that makes it incredibly difficult to be able to go toe-to-toe with the sloganeering and the messaging and the all of the resources in right-wing organizing toolkits that aren't necessarily there on the left. You know what I mean? So it's, it's automatically a power imbalance, right? If we're being completely honest, and yes, it does come down to having more money, having more opportunity to effectively craft a message and organize around that message and organize around that party and organize around that agenda. And when you have all of these things working in your favor, of course the Overton window is going to continue to shift to the right. Which makes it incredibly difficult for those who find themselves or like to pride themselves on being in the center. They move to the right along with the Overton window. As right-wing rhetoric, sentiments, policies, political expression become more normalized, more accepted, more mainstream. Trumpism, for example, just an abstract concept and a very much so an outlier to our regular politic, took off like a hailstorm, and look how normal it is now. 2 years. Not 2 years, but 1 year. After not even 1 year. I don't want to say 2 years. 2 years. 4 years after Donald Trump was, elected president. There's plenty of people who need help that aren't right-wing and are actively oppressed by right-wingers. That's where we focus exactly. Well, the GOP is dead. What? No, it's not. What do you mean? GOP ain't dead? I mean, we're seeing we're seeing an uprise in people who are a little bit more interested in socialism, and that's because we're at the end of our ropes. We're at our wits' end here. We are suffering the consequences of a failed capitalist economy. So of course the youngsters, they are more open-minded to socialism because they are the ones who have been fucked over by capitalism. Hi Lusa, how are you doing? It's good to see you. We're talking 2 economic recessions. We're talking about a transfer in wealth that has led to grotesque levels of wealth inequality. The disparity that we have amongst our ruling and working class is comparable to where it was during the Great Depression. Wage stagnation, people having to work 2 to 3 jobs, the cost of housing tripling the cost of wages, or the price of wages. How are we supposed to survive? We are spread so super thin. We are not going to survive. Of course, socialist programs sound like not only a good idea, but might save our lives. They are life-saving programs that do come down to life or death in some instances. Austerity has ripped us apart and has reduced us down to so I don't want to say like, I want to make it sound like we're strong as members of the proletariat, but we're also incredibly exhausted because of our forced participation in the economy. That is exhaustive by design, so that we are alienated from our communities, not just our work. We have the burden of unemployment hovering over us that makes us perform and compete in the workplace. We know that we have to buy into the bare minimums, and if we cannot survive on our prominent source of employment, we must take on secondary jobs. Even more than that, we are expected to make adjustments in our own lives in order to survive. And that is not a sustainable economic model that is meant to last in perpetuity. It's only a matter of time before the American empire implodes. Richard Wolff says, the time is nigh. It's happening right now. We just don't know it yet. Or maybe we're starting to realize it. So, how much longer do we have until this system completely collapses? A defeatist leftist troll, Jimmy, what? Yeah, okay. Anyway. Sorry, let's get back to this.
If you do your job right and convey the message appropriately, there's no way they'll reject you, as the things we want are directly in their and
Rome
our
didn't
interests.
collapse in a day.
Now, suppose you have a bunch of people together. You're motivated, dedicated, educated, and ready.
But why did Rome collapse? Why did Rome collapse? Was it conquered by other colonists? No. Rome literally imploded because it was the same deal as the United States. Empires of trust. That's why, scholars are comparing the Empire of Rome to the American Empire as an empire of trust. And the reason for Rome's demise was because life inside of Rome got so incredibly bad. The social and economic divide amongst Rome's citizens ultimately led to that implosion, that collapse. The Roman Empire collapsed because it was an empire, and empires end. It fell from within as from without. That's a good way to put it too, by Petsnake. Shit.
Need to help. What's the next step? Your best bet is to start small. After your attempts at forming a basic political program, you'll need to find out what exactly is needed by your community.
True.
How exactly do you find this out, though?
Really?
9. Democratic centralism and the mass line. The correct questions need to be asked. How are correct ideas reached? How do we know we are actually meeting the needs of our communities? What steps should be taken to reach a correct analysis and a solid political program? All of these questions are answered by the Chinese revolutionary experience and their application of the mass line. What is the mass line, though? Let's quote Mao and see what he has to say.
All correct leadership is necessarily from the masses to the masses. This means take the ideas of the masses, scattered and unsystematic ideas, and concentrate them. Through study, turn them into concentrated and systematic ideas. Then go to the masses and propagate and explain these ideas until the masses embrace them as their own, hold fast to them, and translate them into action and test the correctness of these ideas in such action. Then, once again, concentrate ideas from the masses and once again go to the masses so that the ideas are persevered in and carried through. And so on, over and over again in an endless spiral, with the ideas becoming more correct, more vital, and richer each time. Such is the Marxist theory of knowledge.
This is the kernel of correct political approach. Discuss, identify the scattered and unclear grievances of the community you're attempting to reach, formulate and concentrate those ideas and bring them back to that community. Through a constant cycle of collaborative corrections and modifications, the correct conclusions and phases of action can be reached. Where does democratic centralism fall into all of this? What is it, exactly? Well, it's the Leninist idea of diversity in discussion and unity in action. You can have a vibrant democratic atmosphere once proposals are being put forward and discussed, but once a democratic consensus is reached on a decision, everyone, including those that don't necessarily agree with said democratic consensus, should abide by and follow through with the decision of the majority. In this way, we can ensure that our efforts are targeted, full-bodied, and successful. Otherwise, we leave room for fragmentation, factionalism, and a castration of the main push of the organization. We need to ensure that the limited resources that we do have, be it labor or money or whatever else, aren't needlessly wasted because of weak and scattered pushes in all directions. Now, of course, this isn't the correct approach in absolutely 100% of cases, and I again refer you to a proper analysis of your material conditions. 10. The role of the individual. It's always good to remember that different people have different capacities. Some can be background figures, while others foreground. Some are comfortable and enjoy speaking publicly, others like to be more reserved. Socialism is an inclusive movement, and not everyone needs to be in the thick of it, organizing strikes and battling it out with the repressive forces of the state or whatever. If you're the type that dislikes large gatherings or gets anxious with burdens of administration or logistical work, that's equally fine. Whatever you can contribute, be it writing or art or even simple packaging work, for example in grocery drives, is appreciated and directly contributes to the movement. With that said, I think everyone should try their hand in administrative work. It's a lot easier than it sounds, I promise you. One entry point that I think most could find easy to do, find personally fulfilling, and not too burdensome is gardening. In particular, community gardens for growing food. There are endless videos and books on the topic, and meeting at least part of your community's grocery needs for free is one of the quickest ways to winning their trust and getting them involved as well. This, combined with community volunteers and political education, is one of many seeds, pardon the pun, that can germinate into larger organizations. This just so happens to be a fairly tame and cheap introductory point, and that's intentional. With more volunteers, basic daycare facilities to working parents can be provided. Having the assistance of some nurses and doctors that are willing to donate their time, even basic forms of healthcare could be provided, too. With sufficient growth, you can even expand to developing collective housing units. I'm not saying luxury condos, but something small you can provide to the homeless in your area. I'm not sure about you, but where I'm from, concrete, beams, and piping material is very cheap. If that's not possible, then take a look at whatever cheap rundown or abandoned structure in your area you can get a hold of, refurbish it, and turn it into housing. Hold on, why the sudden jump to rudimentary housing, you ask? Well, the question of the lumpen proletariat cannot be ignored. In the US, the homeless are the largest subsection of America's lumpen proletariat. For example, unemployed and stripped of their humanity, under capitalism they're just cast aside to rot, essentially. In an equal and democratically arranged society, these people have so much to contribute and are willing to. Knowing this, they can be one of the greatest sources of revolutionary commitment when the time comes. These community gardens, basic housing blocks, organizational tasks, etc. are all avenues for reincorporating them into your community. Not only would working with them restore their dignity, but would also give a form of productive employment to people who are more than willing to contribute if given the chance. This isn't pity or self-serving charity. This is a recognition of our condition in theirs. All of this begins with a conversation and a few seeds in some pots. The only thing you need is action. 11. Tasks of the Western left. A lot of what I've said here has been of universal applicability, but here's one point I'd like to extend to the Western, and specifically American left. It should go without saying that the number one global threat to leftist movements worldwide is the American imperial machine. Be it through sanctions, diplomatic and material support of reactionary forces, or outright invasion, the US has killed more revolutionary movements in their cradle than any other country. This means that, as American, and other NATO ally nation leftists, a sacred duty falls on your shoulders. To put it concretely, resisting American imperialism internally by preventing the US government from exercising its imperial ambitions abroad, and directly supporting those movements abroad, will open up possibilities not before known to the American left. This is all well and good, but how do we do this? Simple. You form anti-war organizations, and you turn all existing mutual aid or other organizations into anti-war organizations as well. You can still do all your regular work, but you can associate and broaden your criticism by involving anti-imperialism as well. The vast majority of the American and other NATO ally nation working classes do not benefit from these wars. In fact, just the opposite. Resisting American oppression abroad is resisting American oppression within. When it comes to educating your fellow countrymen on this, you have to remember that many may have the perspective of liberals, a worldview that is thoroughly centered on the "a few bad apples" analysis. They seem to be unable of grasping that some institutions are simply made to perpetuate and reproduce what we'd want to morally condemn, be it police violence or military atrocities or economic practices under capitalism. Not because they're evil, but because it serves certain class interests and maintains the status quo, or raises profits.
They're evil.
Moralism plays no part here. That doesn't mean appealing to the liberals' moral sense is useless, though. In my opinion, it's a great first step. Towards that point, I can recommend two works, Killing Hope by William Blum and The Triumph of Evil by Austin Murphy. Read these two works, discuss them with your communities, and share that knowledge. Work towards changing the perception of the US military and US foreign policy and US action worldwide. I get that must be very difficult in such a highly militarized country, but your work now, if successful, will save countless lives down the road. Related actions can be educating yourself and others on movements abroad, raising money, and...
Evil is only really useful as a term for emotional manipulation. What do you mean, Spork of Death?
material for them, whatever they require or advertise through their above-ground organizations, like in, for example, the Philippines. Protesting US actions against them, and even sabotage if the movement within your country is mature enough. The Black Panthers directly supported countless movements abroad, and in turn got support as well. Conclusion. This may have been an unnecessarily long video, but I hope it helps give at least a general picture of our approach. This isn't a step-by-step guide to revolution, but more of a primer to the very first blocks you can put in place. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Candace, Get Organized Starling, what a lovely and relevant name, Caspian, Ted, Philip Shamus, Khadija, Chris Dracker, Boatface...
Damn, they read out all that? It's heavily emotionally charged, but heavily subjective term. It has completely different meanings to different people. To liberals, any movement that uses violence to oppose the status quo is evil. If someone wanted to get into and learn data science, is a bit there's a on the data science course. I've been looking at this Code data. Let's see, Code Academy. Code Academy has a data scientist course. Try it for free. I think you might have to eventually pay for it if you're willing to throw some money toward learning. I guess you get like an actual certification. I don't know how much it's worth to you. It includes SQL, Python 3, and a couple other programs. You learn a couple different languages along the way. The Nazis didn't think they were evil. If you told them they were, they just have been, like, know you, and they'd believe it. Well, the way that I see it is that, yeah, you're not going to convince a Nazi that they're evil. But if you're trying to convince a member of the subaltern class, who maybe has been, indoctrination is a hell of a drug. If you're trying to talk to, like, your fellow working class neighbor, and you're trying to get them involved in organizing, and maybe they are interested, they're not willing to make that investment. I would say that more so than anything else, like, you don't have to convince anybody that the government is evil, that the Republican Party is evil, the Democratic Party is pretty evil too. I think people are literally afraid of some ramifications of losing their jobs. Right? Capitalism is 100% evil. And that's the reason why people are fearful of getting out there and organizing. Not only because they're fucking exhausted, because, you know, we have so much pressure put on us to be able to make ends meet, that at the forefront of our conversations is not about our communities so much as our own economic precarities, and how we are going to, how are we going to be able to skate by on the bare minimum? So we're forced to constantly think about our material wealth. Either you are at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder, and your obsession is whether or not you're gonna be able to make ends meet, or the more money you make, the more it seems to be about how can you hoard your money. This is very reductive, of course. I'm just trying to make a point that if you do fall at the bottom of our social hierarchy and your material conditions do not allow you to live comfortably, much less set aside time to organize in your own community, then you are going to have a really strong argument to find time out of your day to get involved politically with somebody who is already literally at the end of their rope. My obsession is survival. A lot of people's obsession is survival, unfortunately. Boy. Oh, yeah. Protests work because Amazon believes in BLM? Okay, you threw up the kappa. See, my nuts are small. I can't get a read on you. You just jump all over the place. Pretty sure their nuts are small. have a lot of different views. One of us? We're an echo chamber. Just kidding. But really. What's the read on me? I'm not going down that. I'm not doing that. I'm just waiting for the content. Well, then you're gonna be waiting forever.